Well, welcome everyone um, to the fourth webinar hosted by Church Innovations. In our first three webinars, we explored worship and preaching and spiritual practices in the midst of a pandemic during the fall webinar series. And now during the fall webinar series, we are intentionally placing the conversation in the context of local congregations, trying to navigate grief, conflict, discernment, and adaptive change. Mark is going to give further introduction comments to today's webinar, but let me begin with the following. Those of us who work and serve faith communities through Church Innovations deeply believe that God in Jesus, through the power of the Spirit, is leading faith communities deeper into the mission of God. These promptings, these nudgings, being called is not a one-size-fits-all. Each faith community is unique. And each of our faith communities have to discern how it is God is calling and sending us. Over the 30 plus years of consulting that Church Innovations has engaged in, we've discovered that congregational innovation will involve grief. Grieving occurs because grieving includes a sense of loss. And loss always brings its cousin along for the ride, the cousin named disorientation. In Pat's yearly pilgrimage with co-learners to Yellowstone National Park this year, it became very obvious how Christian faith leaders and Christian communities are grieving through the pandemic. Congregations are grieving for any number of reasons: loss of ministers, loss of financial stability, loss of numerical growth, loss of mission and vision. This loss has led congregations to become disoriented during the pandemic. So we're going to kickstart our webinars this fall with a session on grief. Mark, who is Program Director of Missional Leadership at Rochester University, will start us off describing how we are finding ourselves in a place of grief. Following Mark, Beth, who is lead pastor at Mount Olivet Lutheran Church in Plymouth, Minnesota, will talk about her experience. Following Beth, Beth and I are going to moderate questions from the audience. And both Mark and Pat then will wrap up the webinar doing the hard work of reflecting on what we are learning together. Before Mark steps in, why don't we begin with a word of prayer? Let's pray together. Oh God, let your Spirit be present in our lives and in the life of your church. Give us wisdom and discernment as we navigate our life in you through a pandemic. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Mark?
All right, Nathan, thanks. And let me add my welcome to Nathan's and begin my comments by saying how important I think this topic is. I was at the Yellowstone gathering that Nathan mentioned, and we spent 3 days interrogating our own experiences of the pandemic, focused on the question, what might God be calling us to be or to do in light of this experience? As Pat is fond of saying, a pandemic is a terrible thing to waste. So, in this time of disorientation, what could we learn? What might help us envision a new future based upon what we've learned over the last 2 years? The big thing we learned at Yellowstone is that we were angry. And this surprised me. Of course, we were disappointed, and I expected that we'd say even that we were sad, because all of us had suffered real losses and would be impacted by that for who knows how long. But we were more than sad or disappointed. We were angry. We were angry about George Floyd. We were angry about January 6th. We were angry about masks and vaccines. We were just plain angry. And this struck me because I always thought of the other side as the angry ones. I wasn't angry, they were angry. But here we all were now, both sides. All of these issues were angry. And while anger can be fuel for some short-term gains, anger only serves to make the lines that divide us sharper and clearer. Anger deepens the us and them that we live in. And I think some of that work might be necessary to make the stakes clear. But ultimately, there's no way forward around anger. But it also became clear to me that we were angry around what we'd lost, or were fearful that we were losing, and that others were angry about what they were experiencing as loss. And so that's the occasion for grief. Grief is hard work. We'd rather try to win back what we've lost than grieve the loss. And we're conditioned to deny death, to minimize our losses, and to pretend everything's okay. And grief makes us face reality. It makes us name our pain and even admit things may never be again what they once were. So it's harder work, the work of grief. But grief also allows things and accomplishes things that anger can't accomplish. Anger puffs us up, makes us big, particularly in relationship to other people who are on other sides of issues from us. It pretends toward invulnerability. But grief makes us low. And in doing that, it makes us vulnerable, both to others and to a new future. Anger pits us against things or others, it divides us. But grief is a leveler. We're all on the same side of loss, even if those losses are different or experienced differently from person to person, from group to group. So grief marks our common humanity in a way that anger doesn't or can't. Anger and grief are obviously not mutually exclusive. Anger is a part of grief, but grief is larger than anger. And grief allows the possibility of vulnerability and therefore of understanding each other in ways that anger doesn't. It also, though, this observation also led to another, that we don't, as a society, grieve well publicly. There's no room in our political life to grieve. Fundraising and re-election in politics is dependent on keeping the base angry or fearful. We have people, therapists, pastors, who can help us grieve our private losses, but we have little capacity for public grief. We lack spaces in which that work can occur. And so we began to wonder together whether or not this might be something CI can help churches with, to discover as part of their missional vocation, providing space for us to grieve collectively, to be a midwife of sorts for the various constituencies in our world who are angry and experiencing loss. Could we invite them into grief? We're not, generally speaking, good at this. We know how to praise, but not lament. We don't provide much space in our ordinary congregational life for listening and storytelling. And most of what we do along those lines is only internal to our community, which is important. But I am beginning to wonder whether or not this might be a part of the church's public vocation, that we invite others into this journey of grieving their loss. And I think we lack some of the key capacities as a congregation that we would need to take up this work, or at least we haven't recognized what some of those key capacities would be, and we tend not to organize our life around those capacities. But we can learn them. Beth, in a little while, will tell us why her church is attending to their loss in the midst of the pandemic, both why and kind of how they are taking up this work, and hopefully that'll give the rest of us some ideas about how we might want to do that. And I think Pat's going to help us think about what capacities congregations would need to take up this work, and also to give us a sense of some ways that CI has already developed ways to do this, or imagined ways that CI could help churches grieve. I just kind of want to say one more thing to conclude my work. I think part of our anger is stoked by public media. Ratings are created by keeping us angry, and I think that that kind of public presentation, that public portrayal of who we are, may not be what we find when we actually listen to people. That and the thing about the pandemic is how much of our life has gone unobserved. So we work from home. We've not been meeting in the same place for worship. Much of our life has gone unobserved. And so it seems to me that one important thing to do in relationship to the pandemic is to make people's experience somehow visible. And I think if we can, then we might learn that we're in a different place than we imagine that we are. And at least we'll have a thicker description of what's happened in the lives of people during the pandemic. So those are kind of my opening remarks. And Pat, I will turn things over to you.
I think Beth is up here first, right?
Oh, is that right? I threw it to the wrong person then. Okay, Beth, tell us what you're up to.
Yeah, as I was listening to you, Mark, in our context, it wasn't until this fall that we came back in person in the sanctuary with masks. And it was nearly impossible to put arms around who we were as a community because although we may have seen each other on a screen or in a public place, this loss of people. And what I noticed right away was people did not have any place to put what they were feeling. And there is some expectation of an elevator speech when you see someone that you haven't seen for a long time, like, I'm just going to tell you this much. And I always could tell there was more. And yet people were so hesitant to go there. And what we kept coming back to is how can we hold this as a community? Obviously, as a leader in this community, people would come to me and spill the junk drawer. And I was there to listen, but we have to share this as a community, not just one person. And anger was there, this loss of control. Why has my church abandoned me? Why could church change in the midst of this? And a really big noticing was people, their prayers were personal, very individualized. It was so hard to look outward to a community and pray for someone else or take on someone else's experience, or to consider that experience as we were making decisions. And I kept going back to, we need to make decisions on behalf of a community, but what is community now? So I went back to David Isay's book, Listening is an Act of Love. And that's how we've premised it here at Mount Olivet, that in order to come back, our act of love is actually to listen to experience. And I think, Mark, to your point, make them visible, and to say each story matters. Each person matters so much that it is the future for where we will go. And if we miss this, then we miss receiving from each other what someone else experienced and this commonality or this connection that comes along with it. And I also feel that a community has to hold all of this for each other. It can't just be going to one place. And we have rituals and traditions to be able to lament. We have scriptures to bring us back to that. And so our work at Mount Olivet, we're calling it The Story Unfolds, which ties to our mission statement. But this unfolding of God's story biblically, but also in real time with us right now, that it's not over, it has to unfold, but telling our story and grieving and naming the pain. Yeah. And it's hard for us not to say, oh, but this good thing happened, because there's a lot of people where there is no good that has happened. Right. They're mad and they're frustrated and they're having a hard time being neighbors with one another. And so we completed a micro listening session. We had about 6 leaders among us do about 5 conversations each, where we asked very accessible questions. What are words you would use to describe the last 18 months? What has been a loss and a disappointment? Where have you been surprised by hope? And what do you want to say to your community about this? And what do you think God may be up to in this? Some people completely connected with it. And if they didn't with the connections, they knew just by reaching out to them, like, I want to hear from you. And so there was just interpersonal connection that happened there. And then we're also inviting the larger community into a more corporate event during worship, where everyone can name a hard day, a good day, and where they find hope. And what we're saying is we're taking all of this listening and we're going to sit with it, all of this data and all of this story that is flesh and blood, And we will sit with it and trust that God is somewhere in the midst of that. And that is going to be the futuristic sense of where we're going as a church. So there's a pause, which is hard for people. They just want to move on to the next thing.
Right.
But I don't really think that we can be true community to each other unless we have this opportunity to be able to do that. But it's very invitational. You can't make people do it. But what I'm finding is it goes a long way to say, we want to hear from you. We want to hear about your experiences, because what you share is received as gift, or might help someone else for them to realize that what they experienced was maybe very similar, and to begin talking in places where people will not talk.
Yeah, great stuff, Beth. I like both the notion that you see this as not a finished thing, that we're not now we're trying to tie up and say this is exactly what we learned, but you see it as an ongoing journey, and you've provided places to make people who've been invisible visible. You've provided ways to narrate the experience of the community. I think those are all great instincts related to grief. So, Pat, now.
So what I want to do is start by doing a little reflecting on what I've heard you and Beth say, and maybe tease out some of the things I think I might want to make some assertions about, but initially here I want to attend to them. So Beth came to Church Innovations. We worked together at other times. Mount Olivet had been one of the key congregations in a cluster for the Partnership for Missional Church. And out of that, they came to a sense initially that, you know, they are on a journey, and that this is a story that they're part of. And so this congregation's been working this theme for a while. So the first thing I want to say is most congregations don't have the insight that Mount Olivet has, the degree to which they are on to use Wes Granberg Nicholson's language, a pilgrimage without oars. You know, this is, we're not on an already determined plan, and we know exactly how it's going to work out. We've got our 5-year plan, and we're going to fill in the gap here. That isn't the way that this very thriving, very exciting congregation views itself. It's a big deal. The narrative within which they live is pretty stunning. I want to underline that, and that's a big deal. Then I want to begin with a really simple definition again that we've worked for over 40 years at Church Innovations, borrowed from sociologist Richard Sennett. What is public? Public is the interaction of strangers through a shared set of actions. And a church, let us never forget, is irreducibly public. It is the interaction of strangers through a shared set of actions. Yes, there are dynamics in the church that are much like a family. We are, of course, sisters and brothers in Christ. But as a simple fact, sociological fact, healthy congregations are not families. They are companies of strangers. And therefore, to do this work that you and Beth are creatively, innovatively doing is not something outside the limits of what it means to be church. It is an essential characteristic, or at least a bene esse, of what it is to be church. Indeed, as one of your teachers and my colleague Gary Simpson says, local churches are public moral companions, deliberately using that language of campagna to go with bread, about the basics of life, and to go with people. And it's this company of strangers. So that's an essential characteristic. I'll tell you, that's not normal either. Most congregations I meet think of themselves as, if not a big happy family, at least they ought to be a big happy family. Although I've never met one of those congregations, there is this presumption. And there are none of those in the New Testament. Almost all the books of the New Testament are letters that the German scholars call Streitschriften, fighting. There's always a battle going on, so Paul needs to write. So apparently conflict is of the essence of the church. We like to say at Church Innovations, conflict is constantly the Holy Spirit inviting the church to multiply its mission. So we're not shocked here that at Mount Olivet, when people gather, they're angry. They're pissing, moaning, and groaning. If it's a healthy congregation, this is a place that people feel, if not utterly safe, such places don't exist, but as strangers, they have, this congregation has the capacity to allow them to be angry, because anger is almost always a secondary emotion for hurt, fear, harm, and there's a lot of that going on. And you're right, I want to underline, we live in a culture that essentially denies death. And if you're not an optimist and saying everything is getting better, then the only other thing is your so-called prophet who is angry. And the way you show that you take something seriously is you reinforce anger. And our public media know that works. So I want to talk about what are the existing capacities in churches that I see and that we've learned over the years make possible, in the company of strangers, the hard work of things like grief. For years now, we've done a thing called the historical timeline, or the timeline for a congregation, where we gather the congregation to do exactly what Beth said. I thought it was great. Literally on Post-it notes, green ones, blue ones, and red ones, name a hard day and what was hard about it, put it up on the wall, on the date, etc., decades long. A good day, what we call red letter days, and a green day, a day that gives that person hope. Now what's happened is we've placed it at some distance. Their names aren't on it. This is one of the key characteristics of public ritual. I want to go over a very basic concept here. These are all rituals. They're meaningless as private discourse. They're precisely designed for the company of strangers. What most Americans would say is useless, because the only thing that really counts is how I feel. But these are all designed to externalize and make it public. My favorite example is a Dick Cavett. Those of you people who are, younger than I've never even heard of him probably, but he used to do a pretty good evening talk show. And he had a great actor on, it was like the third or fourth person, by the name of Laurence Olivier, came on. And Cavett looked into the national television, said, everybody stand up, turn around, and act as if they're pulling their zipper up. Now, most of the people up there were already women, and they weren't wearing anything that at least he was referring to as a zipper. But everyone, including the audience, did. Everyone stood up, went through the action of pulling his zipper up, and turned around and sat back down. Now, for at least one person, we can presume it was a very necessary public act that could have been shaming. But everyone participated in it. What made it work was precisely that it wasn't personal, that it was public, and we were doing this as a way of creating a safe enough space, what people like Ron Heifetz at Kennedy School of Government calls a holding environment, safe enough for people to interact as a company of strangers. That's what things like the historical timeline for a congregation does. It gets that distance. It allows individuals a relatively safe way of dealing with extremely important matters. For some of them, maybe life or death, where if they were to discuss them, the shame of it would itself lead them to despair. So what's happening with Mount Olivet and its work with CI is we're creating those holding environments. That's the thing we're really good at. We've been doing that for 30 plus years, helping congregations deal with that. We say there are 6 public practices, we call them missional practices, that create that sort of holding tank. And dwelling in the word is the first one, and one of its chief characteristics, and I'll end here with this example there. I could, as you know, I could go on and on. But the first thing one does upon hearing the scripture read aloud is to go and find a reasonably friendly looking stranger and listen that person into free speech. This is the heart of what Beth said is important here, right? Listening. I realized that I grew up in a church that thought its first and foremost and really almost only important thing to do is preach at folk. And that's not a bad thing. The Reformation wouldn't have happened without some pretty good preaching, but it's equally important, and perhaps a condition for the possibility of preaching, is learning to listen. And listen another person into free speech, and have the imagination to wonder, what is God up to here? Of course, we have other practices we've been teaching that we've learned how to help local churches be public companions, to be these sorts of relatively safer holding environments. The second thing, of course, is local churches can be truth seekers. And in a society like ours, we need all the truth-seeking communities we can get our hands on. And truth-seeking begins by not just having experience, but reflecting on it and articulating what we've learned. And that's also right at the heart of what Mount Olivet's doing. Anyway, I've gone on a bit too long, sorry.
You're fine. So I'm wondering if there might, so what I heard you say, Pat, is that the work of grief requires spaces in which that work can take place, spaces that are formed around listening, and listening to the truth and finding ways that people can express truth without being exposed to shame or judgment by the others that they're involved with. So I'm wondering if I'm a pastor and I think that the part of the missional vocation of a congregation is to be a companion with others in their grief, not just the people who are members of our congregation, but the immediate communities that we're in. I'm wondering if there are ways that we could create spaces for that as well. So I'm thinking, like yesterday, I passed a fence that had been, flowers had been put in the fence, and it was the sign, clearly the sign of a place where someone had lost their life in an accident. And this was public, anonymous grief. And I'm wondering if churches could provide public space where people could artistically or with words or notes or create kind of a wailing wall, a place where they could come and say, this is not all right. And at least not invite them into more than that until they might be ready for more, So I'm wondering, Beth, Pat, Nathan, if you guys have a reaction to that or similar ideas.
Well, I would strongly endorse that. When I first walked into this with CARE was when CI was doing research among Inupiats up on the Arctic Circle in villages where that were all Lutheran, which is my particular denomination. They were all Lutheran because when the last big pandemic in 2005 and 1917, the Spanish flu was brought to these villages by the whites going there. Nome is the biggest town on the Seward Peninsula. It's on the way south side of it. They brought the Spanish flu, killing off almost all the adults. And so all these villages had only children, and these women deaconesses, one by the name of Helen Frost, wonderful journal. Her journal was published as Frost Among the Eskimos. Hard to believe that title. But anyway, Helen and several other deaconesses started to care for and created orphanages, raising all of these Inupiats Lutheran. But if you're a young male in a Inupiat community, your odds of being dead by 26 is 40%. Will be dead by the age they're 26, and usually by risk behavior, including suicide. And so we began to take a look at how do we begin to change the level of violence. Almost every home had very serious domestic violence, and there was this huge death rate among young males. And working with the local community using our congregational discovery process, which, as you know, is ethnography, we began to discover that basically people were left to grieve alone and isolated in that setting. The anxiety grew and the violence grew. And so we began to take a look at the capacities within Inupiat culture for public grieving. And one of the really important things is song and dance, and the importance of gathering groups of people to sing and to dance their grief. And what a massive difference this made in the life of these people. And I went, duh, what, you know, where are our public song and dances over grief? And what if our congregations like these Inupiats could become places where you could sing and dance grief and anger? And, you know, of course, grief has a long cycle. There's there's denial, there's anger, there's, you know, negotiation and acceptance. But and once again, I could go on and on what I've learned from the Inupiat community and tried to find ways in our postmodern, post-industrial culture for our local churches to become, you know, song and dance places for grief. But there are ways, and there are some communities, and especially in certain African American settings, I have seen this power.
Yeah, Beth, anything to add to that, or other ideas that you
We
played with?
we've played with a neighborhood walk where we walk through the neighborhood and stop at places of death and tragedy.
Mm.
And we tell the stories of what happened, either in the driveway of this one particular home or on the street corner. And we have over the years invited the neighborhood to participate by having the neighborhood tell the stories. And so that then invites the neighborhood to name the loss and what they're grieving. But then we've discovered that it invites a sense of wonder, of discernment. How then in these places of death will we become people of peace and hope? So it's not a wailing wall, right? And it's not a dance, it's a walk. Yeah. Where stories are told, right?
Yeah, and it's embodied, it's public. You're being hosted, you're not the host. Those to me are all great missional instincts. That's a great example, Nathan. Beth?
Yeah, I was really taken healing the city, which was the public space after George Floyd's murder, for people to come and to pray for the minutes and the seconds that he was held under. And they had little strips of fabric, and anyone who came was asked to tie a strip of fabric around the tents that they had up. And I was so taken that when I was there weren't a lot of people, but the fabric strips told the story of how many people had come. And so we did a version of that at church, that if you came and prayed outside, that you put a piece of fabric around a metal wreath. And we just called the space Lament and Pray. But a huge part of that was tie a piece of fabric, because the next person will come knows that they are not alone in their grief, even if you can't be with them. Right. And so now that we can be inside, we're really ritualizing that wreath and the pieces of fabric as our story that moves on to this other story. But just to be out in the city and see these tent poles just filled with pieces of fabric, it was really meaningful, really significant, and a marker of this presence of community, even though we are this kind of more stranger sense of that.
Yeah. Again, the ritual, the ways that we're indicating that we're not alone without having to identify our own kind of personal place and all of that. So it's a personal experience, but it's still public and not risky in that way. Julie has a couple of comments in the chat that they're definitely in her context envisioning a wailing wall and also a chance to sing our grief and lament when it's safe again. And I think she highlights the importance of something other than kind of a rational approach to dealing with grief. You know, laying out the stages, doing this to address a stage, whatever. But the importance of an embodied act like singing, and singing in a community, songs that are full of meaning and that tie God to our experience of life. But you're right, Julie. The pandemic is, in that sense, limiting our capacity to take up that kind of work. And I, with you, anticipate the day when we will be able to do that. So I'm thinking not only in terms of these public rituals, but I'm thinking of capacities that congregations might have to have. So the way we talk about capacity is, what do you have to know? What's the minimum you have to know? Take up this work. What attitudes and beliefs would you have to take up this work? What are the skills you'd have to have? And what are the practices and habits that we can pass on to others as we take up this work? So I'm wondering where we might identify places to build congregational capacity. And I think the one big thing we've already identified that's related to both attitudes and beliefs and skills and habits is just the idea of listening. And that, and I will say too, that congregations are not built to listen. They're built to do worship on Sundays, and they communicate from the front to the members or in the bulletin to the members, but they don't regularly provide places for feedback. They get complaints. I'm not saying there's not feedback, but to create an intentional space for listening, and for that to be kind of an ongoing part of their life. So I'm gonna let you guys jump in. I'm gonna go get a drink of water.
Well, I spent the majority of my morning since 5 in the morning until just before joining you all on another conference via Zoom hosted by Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and working on some of the themes of how local churches can be missional in this COVID circumstance. And we had we had people like Imli Jamir from Nagaland in India, and James Chai from Taiwan, and my colleague Michael Chan. But one of the things that is quite clear, that is confirmed by this conversation, is it's not just American culture. It's very hard to come to terms with the level of pain that COVID is creating in people's lives, and how difficult it is for local churches in these various sundry cultures to, and this includes African initiated Pentecostal churches, which was a major portion of the people this morning, how difficult it is to create public space that it's all right to express the negative and to listen to people talk about that, because of this very strong and I think understandable need to have public space be as uplifting and positive as we possibly can. I've had to bury several family members during COVID. And it's amazing to me how many churches have given up on funerals and have celebrations of life. And in the celebration of life, there just isn't room for people to grieve. There are some very old-fashioned things churches do, like have a liturgy for the burial of the dead, that allow for a much wider range of human emotion, both positive, negative, ambivalent, dance on their grave or what. I think we need to look at this wellspring of capacities, as Mark has put it, that exists within our communities and our tradition, and play those out. I could go on with examples, but that's the underlying theme.
So, pardon me if I repeat something, Pat, that you said, but I think going back to Nathan's comment in the chat, that there are risks, there are potential dangers in taking up this work. It seems to me that that's right? If you invite people to share their experiences, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? Now there are things in front of us that we have to deal with. So there are risks, but I'm wondering if part of the capacity we have to build here is what you said earlier, that that conflict, that grief, that anger, that these are not the enemy, and that adaptive work passes through those, not around them. And so there would have to be a belief that if we deal with what's in front of us now, we have a more likely, hopeful future in the near term than if we kick the can down the road and choose not to deal with them or ignore them or try to get back to business as usual. And I think what Beth is doing with Mount Olivet is precisely instilling that kind of attitude and belief within the congregation by pausing to say, we're going to listen for a while, because we believe that this is the path through to a more hopeful future.
And Mark, I want to piggyback on all this. When I read the initial listening responses, I mean, it hurt. I mean, because people are not telling you the sweet stories. They were ticked and angry, and yet that was set free. And now we can hold that as a community. Like, we can just name it and give permission to do it. And the part for me is, if you can't be mad or angry or sad or grieving or hopeful at church, then where are you going to be that?
Right.
It's not Little League practice. It's not at a school conference, maybe at your therapy session. But
Right.
if you really want to be a community that says, what does God have to say about it and what do we have to say about it? Then you're going to have to deal with the ankle bites of this and the deeper wounds that are there. But at the same time, when you can name it, there was also things that surfaced, like, how do we build a community that can support each other in grief and struggle, and not just have it be held on certain people, that
Mhm.
there's actually a community here that cares what you're going through, and a place for you to share that or process that. And it's not just within church, it's a wider community on that too. So, I mean, it's not easy work at all, but it's also really important work.
Yeah.
Wasn't in though, again, to ask kind of Mark's question, what capacities do leaders need to have, Nin, to facilitate these conversations? Because I am expecting most leaders don't have the ability to hold the space for grieving. They don't want to hold the space, right?
Yeah, I guess, Nathan, I would say this gets back to what Pat was talking about in terms of creating holding spaces, maintaining holding spaces. So what are the kinds of things you do there? Well, you name what your common commitments are. So in grief, being able to tell the truth about our experience without judgment from anyone else would have to be a commitment that we share to take up this work. Identifying, Heifetz and Linsky talk about identifying lateral bonds of affection, knowing where the networks of care already exist and where they aren't, and strengthening the bonds of affection and finding ways to reach out to those who aren't part of the visible networks of care within the congregation, which goes back to what Beth was saying. Teaching each other how to speak to one another. Because we're going to be angry, and there might be feelings of being let down or betrayed, or so how do we express those things in ways that don't tear us down, but have the potential to be a place where we can grow and learn and not vilify one another, but name our kind of common experience. So I could go on with those kinds of things, but they're what Heifetz and Linsky kind of point to. Yeah, we need to wrap up. So, so Nathan, you have our concluding words. Why don't you bring us to a close?
Well, we want to thank everyone for listening in and your participation in today's webinar. Our next webinar is scheduled for October 20th, and we're going to center the conversation around conflict. We're all going to engage in conflict. Congregations will always have conflict, and so how do we move forward through conflict together into the mission of God? We're going to send out a survey to everyone So if you can check your email in the next couple days, as we want to learn from you in order to understand how we can continue to serve congregations with the work of Church Innovations. As we are sent out, may the peace of God go with us, and may we discover and have wisdom in knowing how to lead our faith communities and each other through the process of grieving, so that we can discover the hope of the gospel and the hope of resurrection at work in our faith communities. May we go in peace. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.